My own parents let my sister erase me like I was a typo, and the wild part is they acted like it was keeping the peace. I flew 3,000 miles for her wedding, got turned away at the door, and she laughed like it was funny. So I left one small silver box on the gift table and walked out. Hours later, she opened it in front of 400 people and started screaming. Not because I begged, not because I fought, because the truth finally showed up. If you're interested in this topic, hit the like button, subscribe, and type "interested" in the comments, and I will give you a heart. Let me tell you the part people don't like admitting out loud. Sometimes your first bullies aren't kids at school. They're the adults who raised you. And the worst part is they don't even have to scream to break you. They just have to keep choosing someone else while looking you dead in the face and calling it love. And in my family, love wasn't a safety net. It was a rigged contract where Victoria got the benefits and I got the fine print. I'm Myra Wells. I'm 28 now, but I can point to the exact year I understood I wasn't a daughter in that house. I was a background extra, a convenience spare, the person you only notice when you need someone to carry the emotional trash out to the curb. We lived in a 3-story colonial in Beacon Hill, the kind of house that screams legacy from the outside, manicured hedges, tasteful shutters, neighbors who say good morning like they're reading from a script, a family that looks perfect in Christmas cards because perfection is easy when you're posing for strangers. Inside, 2 daughters, 1 spotlight. Victoria was 3 years older, which in our house might as well have been a crown. She got the bigger bedroom, the nicer clothes, piano lessons, dance recitals with parents who actually showed up and clapped like they meant it. I got hand-me-downs and silence is louder than yelling when it's consistent. I remember being 10, counting down to my birthday like it was a rescue boat, because double digits felt like I was finally going to be seen, like maybe they'd look up and remember, oh right, we have another child. I imagined balloons, cake with my name piped on it, maybe a few friends over. Something normal, something that said you matter. I woke up early that morning and ran downstairs like a hopeful idiot, and the kitchen was empty of anything resembling celebration. My mother was on the phone planning Victoria's upcoming cotillion, like the world depended on which napkin rings matched the theme. My father had already left for work. No happy birthday, no hug, no card, not even the casual fake smile people give coworkers. I stood there in my pajamas, small and embarrassed just for wanting something, and I said, "Mom, it's my birthday." And she covered the receiver like I was interrupting something important because I was. She said, "I know, sweetheart, we'll do something later," with that soothing tone adults use when they want you to stop expecting. Later never came. Not a cupcake. Not a "how was your day?" Not even a pity candle. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, doing that kid thing where you pretend you don't care because caring hurts too much. Then came a knock at the door. Soft, deliberate. It was Grandma Eleanor, my father's mother, holding a small wrapped box and wearing the kind of expression that says she already knows the truth but won't let it swallow you. She sat on the edge of my bed, took my hands in hers and said, "Happy birthday, my darling girl," like the words actually mattered, like they could stitch something back together. Inside the box was a camera. Not a toy, not a plastic thing you break in a day. A real camera with a leather strap and a silver body that felt heavy in my small hands. Heavy like responsibility, heavy like potential. She touched my cheek and said, "You have an artist's eye. One day the world will see what I see in you." I didn't know it then, but she wasn't just giving me a present. She was handing me an exit route. That camera became my secret language, because when nobody sees you, you start seeing everything. You notice how your mother's eyes light up for Victoria and go flat for you. You notice how your father calls Victoria driven and calls you sensitive, like it's a flaw. You notice how people praise the loud child and ignore the quiet one, then act shocked when the quiet one disappears. I started taking pictures of everything. The window light on the staircase, the way shadows moved across our dining room at dusk, the fake smiles at charity events, the real sadness in quiet corners. And it wasn't just art, it was evidence. It was proof I existed in a house that pretended I didn't. Fast forward 8 years, I graduate high school with a full scholarship to Rhode Island School of Design, one of the best art programs in the country, And I'm thinking, okay, this is it. This is the moment they'll finally look at me like a person. I'm chosen to give a speech at graduation. I practice for weeks, reading it out loud until the words feel like they belong to me. And on graduation morning, I come downstairs in my cap and gown, holding my speech notes like they're a ticket into the family, like surely they'll care now. Victoria is at the table scrolling her phone. Smug and bored, my parents are huddled over my father's laptop like they're defusing a bomb. I say, the ceremony starts at 2. We should leave by 1 to get good seats. And my mother doesn't even look up. She says, something came up, the way people say when they don't want to admit the choice they're making. I ask what she means, and my father finally glances at me and says, Victoria has a networking event with Goldman Sachs. It's a huge opportunity for her career. We can't miss it. I stood there in my cap and gown and felt my insides go cold. It's my graduation, I said, and my father's voice went flat, businesslike, dismissive, like he was delivering a policy. Photography isn't a real career, Myra. Maybe you should think about business school like your sister. That sentence did something to me. It didn't just hurt, it rewired me, because it showed me the rules of the house in one clean line. Victoria's future mattered. Mine was optional. And that's what favoritism is. It's not always screaming. It's deciding some dreams are investments and others are hobbies. It's treating one child like a portfolio and the other like a rounding error. Victoria smirked and said nothing, because she didn't have to. The house itself spoke for her. I went to my graduation alone. I gave my speech to a room full of strangers, and when they called my name, I scanned the audience like a fool looking for a miracle, and there was only one familiar face. Grandma Eleanor, front row, clapping louder than anyone, smiling like she was proud enough for 3 adults. Afterward, she took my hands and whispered, Remember, sweetheart, the greatest treasures aren't always the ones people fight over. Sometimes they're the ones quietly passed on. At the time, I thought she meant my scholarship, my talent, my camera. I didn't understand she meant something else too, something that would detonate later in the most public, humiliating way possible for the people who thought they owned the family narrative. After that graduation, I did the thing quiet kids do when they finally accept the truth. I stopped asking. I packed 2 suitcases, bought a one-way ticket to Los Angeles, and I didn't say goodbye because there was no goodbye to give, not to people who barely noticed you were there. LA was loud, anonymous, and freeing because nobody cared who my parents were, and that was the first time in my life that felt like oxygen. I started at the bottom, assistant to a wedding photographer, carrying equipment, adjusting lights, learning angles, learning how to capture the moments people don't realize reveal them, the clenched jaw of a mother who's faking happiness, the bride's eyes scanning a room for approval, the groom's nervous swallow before a vow. I worked like a person with something to prove, not to them, to myself. I saved every penny. I built client by client. I stayed invisible by choice this time because there's a difference between being ignored and moving in silence. My family didn't ask about my work. They didn't ask if I was okay. Victoria called occasionally not to check on me, but to perform her life at me like I was a mirror she used to admire herself. Senior marketing director at 29, she'd say. Corner office. Engaged to a hedge fund manager. Every call was a victory lap, and I was the unpaid audience. One night she called and said, I just closed a 7-figure campaign, and then she laughed and asked, What about you? Still doing those little photo shoots. I was sitting in my office, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown LA, awards on the wall, a team of 12, a calendar booked months out, and I said, I'm doing well, Victoria. Congratulations, because I had learned the most effective way to deal with a person like that is to starve them of your insecurity. She said, Mom and Dad are throwing me a celebration dinner next week. Obviously, you're not invited. It's just immediate family. And I remember staring at the words immediate family like they were a joke written by someone who hated irony. I hung up, looked at the Everlight Studios sign on my wall, the one I paid for with my own money, and I felt something harden into place. Not anger. A decision. I stopped hoping for their approval the way you stop touching a stove that has burned you your whole life. For a while, I told myself I didn't care, that their opinions were irrelevant, that my success was enough. And it was until Grandma Eleanor died and the ground shifted under everything. The call came from a Boston number I didn't recognize. An attorney named Harrison Lawson told me she passed away the night before. I felt like someone had reached into my chest and yanked out the one steady heartbeat I'd always relied on. I flew to Boston immediately. The funeral was held at Trinity Church, packed with hundreds of people, because Grandma Eleanor wasn't just family. She was a force, an arts patron, the kind of woman who funded galleries and scholarships, who believed beauty mattered because it reminded humans they weren't just machines. I sat alone in the third row while my parents stood in front, accepting condolences like they were the official mourners. Victoria beside them in a black designer dress, dabbing at her eyes like she was auditioning for sympathy. But I noticed what she did between hugs, the way she leaned close to my mother and whispered about the jewelry collection, the way my mother glanced at my father, the way their grief kept detouring into inventory. "Have you talked to the lawyer about when we can?" I heard Victoria say before my mother hissed, "Not here." That was when I realized something dark and simple. Some people don't mourn loved ones, they mourn access. After the service, Mr. Lawson touched my shoulder and asked me to stay behind. He led me to a small office at the back of the church, closed the door, and sat across from me with a manila envelope in his hands. He said, "Your grandmother came to see me 2 years ago. She was very specific. What I'm about to show you is separate from her public will." And the way he said separate told me my life was about to fork. He slid the envelope across the table. Inside were documents and a letter. The first was a notarized amendment to her estate, and when I read it, my hand started shaking because the words didn't feel real. The Hartwell jewelry collection, valued at $2.3 million, was mine. Not Victoria's, not my mother's, mine. Then I opened the letter, and Grandma Eleanor's voice poured out of the paper like she was sitting right there. She wrote that Victoria would see those pieces as trophies, status symbols to be displayed and envied. But I would see their history, their meaning, and she wrote the line that still makes my throat tighten. Beauty isn't about possession, it's about preservation. She told me my mother and sister would be angry, that they'd call it a mistake. But she'd watched me become someone remarkable even when no one else was watching, and she trusted me to honor what she built. Mr. Lawson said she wanted it confidential until I decided the right moment to disclose it, and I nodded because I suddenly understood Grandma Eleanor wasn't just giving me jewelry. She was giving me leverage, not to punish, but to protect myself from people who would happily take until I disappeared. I walked out of that church with grief in my chest and a secret in my bag, and I carried it quietly for months, because the truth is a blade and timing decides whether you're using it to cut chains or just swing it around for attention. 3 months later, I hear Victoria is engaged to Marcus Thornton. Old money from Connecticut, the kind of name my parents practically worshipped, and suddenly the whole family goes into status mode. Wedding at the Grand Belmont Hotel, for 100 guests, 6-figure budget, everything curated to look perfect. I wait for my invitation, like an idiot with hope I swore I killed years ago. Weeks pass. Nothing. I refresh my email, check my mail, tell myself maybe it's delayed. Then I call my mother, and her voice gets careful, the way it does when she's about to deliver cruelty wrapped in politeness. She says Victoria wanted her to talk to me, that the wedding was very intimate, and it would be better if I didn't attend. I almost laughed because I had seen Victoria's social media for 100 guests, but somehow my presence was the threat to intimacy. My mother said I could be awkward, that they didn't want distractions from Victoria's day, and in that moment, something inside me snapped cleanly, not messy, not dramatic, just final. Because here's what just happened. My own parents participated in erasing me again, not by accident, but by deliberate choice, and why it matters is simple. If they can ban you from a wedding, they can ban you from any family reality whenever it's convenient. And what could go wrong next is worse, because people who erase you in public will rewrite you in private. They'll tell lies about you to protect their image. They'll paint you as unstable or jealous or embarrassing to justify what they did. And the longer you stay silent, the more their version becomes the truth people remember. That night, I stared at Victoria's posts, dress fittings, registry at Tiffany's, engagement parties, hundreds of comments praising her like she invented love. And I made a decision that scared me because it wasn't about revenge. It was about refusing to be invisible one more time. I'd booked a flight to Boston 3 days before the wedding. I didn't call, didn't ask, didn't warn. I packed a small bag and prepared a gift in a silver box with a white ribbon, small enough to fit in my purse, light enough that nobody would guess it could detonate a lie that big. And I need you with me right here, because at the exact moment the plan becomes real, I'm about to walk into the Grand Belmont Hotel, say my name at the reception table, and find out whether my family has the nerve to erase me to my face in front of strangers. And if they do, the next thing I do will change Victoria's wedding day forever. When the staff flipped through that guest list and looked up at me with pity, I realized the rejection wasn't just private anymore, it was ceremonial, and that's when I understood the silver box wasn't a gift, it was a verdict. I stood there in the marble lobby of the Grand Belmont Hotel with a silver box sweating in my palm and a quiet string quartet bleeding through the walls like polite background noise to my own internal earthquake. And this is where fantasy finally meets reality, because it's easy to imagine being excluded until you're actually watching two strangers flip through a guest list like they're scanning a crime record and then slowly lift their eyes with that specific blend of pity and discomfort that says you're not supposed to exist here. And one of them cleared her throat and said, "I'm sorry, ma'am, your name isn't on the list." And I swear something in my chest cracked like a hairline fracture you don't feel until you put weight on it. So I said calmly, because humiliation teaches you how to sound calm even when you're bleeding internally, "Could you check again? It's Myra Wells. I'm the bride's sister." And she traced the W section again, like the letters might rearrange themselves out of guilt, but they didn't, and the other attendant leaned in and quietly listed off names: Harold Wells, Patricia Wells, Victoria Wells, and then looked at me with softened eyes like she was apologizing on behalf of the universe. No, Myra. And that's when it hit me, not emotionally, but physically, like gravity got heavier for a second. Because this wasn't a misunderstanding, this was a deliberate erasure executed with printed ink and laminated paper. And here's what just happened in plain language. My own family had removed my existence from the official narrative of their biggest public event. Not quietly, not awkwardly, but with institutional confidence. And why it matters is simple. When someone removes your name from the list, they're not just excluding you from a party. They're editing you out of the story they tell about themselves. And what could go wrong next is worse than embarrassment. Because once you let someone rewrite you publicly, they will keep doing it until you disappear completely from memory. And I wasn't going to disappear anymore, so I stepped aside, pulled out my phone, and called the person who had engineered this invisible execution, my sister Victoria, and she answered on the second ring with that sharp, clipped voice she uses when she feels important. And behind her voice I could hear champagne flutes clinking and soft laughter and live music, a soundtrack to my exclusion. And I said, "Victoria, it's Myra. I'm at the hotel and they say my name isn't on the guest list." And there was a pause, not the confused kind, the satisfied kind, the pause of someone who knows exactly what they did and enjoys watching it land. And then she said flatly, "Yeah, that's because you weren't invited." And even though I expected it, the finality of hearing it out loud felt like being pushed into cold water. And I said, "I'm your sister." And she laughed, not a joyful laugh, a brittle superiority laugh, and said, "You really thought you'd be invited? This wedding is for people who matter, Myra, important people, not someone who takes pictures for a living. And if you've ever been dismissed by someone who measures human worth in dollar signs and job titles, you know that sting. It's not about the insult, it's about the worldview behind it, the idea that love is transactional, that family loyalty is conditional, that respect must be purchased." And in that moment, I realized my parents weren't just complicit. They had trained her to speak like this, to see people like this, to treat affection like a social hierarchy instead of a bond. And she kept going, because cruelty feeds itself when it's not challenged. "I didn't ask you to come. Whatever flight you booked is your problem. And what gift could you possibly give me that I don't already have? A free photo session, a scrapbook." And I let her words hit me without flinching, because something inside me had already moved past pain into clarity. And I said quietly, "I just wanted to wish." "Well, I'll leave the gift on the table." And she snapped, "Fine, just don't cause a scene," and hung up like she'd swatted a fly. And I stood there holding my phone while strangers in tuxedos and silk dresses streamed past me into a ballroom I wasn't allowed to enter. And here's the part nobody tells you about rejection. It doesn't always make you cry. Sometimes it makes you eerily calm, because your nervous system realizes the fight is over and the truth is finally undeniable. And that calm is dangerous because it gives you clarity and courage at the same time. And I walked toward the gift table with slow, deliberate steps, past towers of wrapped boxes, Tiffany blue ribbons, crystal packaging, envelopes thick with money, excess piled on top of excess like a shrine to consumption. And I placed my small silver box among them, intentionally near the edge where it would be noticed but not highlighted, like a quiet anomaly in a sea of noise. And the receptionist watched me like she wanted to say something compassionate but didn't know how. And I slid a small card under the ribbon that read, "To Victoria, from your sister Myra." And the word sister looked almost ironic on that table. And as I stepped away, I felt something strange. Not sadness, not anger, but release, because once you accept someone's rejection fully, they lose the power to keep hurting you with it. And I walked out of the hotel into crisp autumn air and booked the next flight back to Los Angeles from my phone while the echo of string instruments faded behind me. And in the taxi, as the hotel disappeared in the rearview mirror, I finally allowed myself to breathe deeply, because the gift was placed, the truth was planted, and now the timeline was out of my hands. But before I tell you what happened inside that ballroom when Victoria reached for that box, I need to rewind you 2 months earlier, because fate has a dark sense of humor, and it had already begun stacking the dominoes long before I ever stepped into that lobby. And this is where the story shifts from emotional betrayal into something sharper, because 2 months earlier I was sitting in my Los Angeles office reviewing invoices when my assistant told me I had a call from Caroline Ashford. And if you know anything about high-end weddings, that name carries weight. Caroline Ashford runs one of the most elite event planning firms on the East Coast, senators, celebrities, old money families, and she also happened to be one of Grandma Eleanor's closest friends. So when I answered, she said warmly, "Myra, Eleanor talked about you constantly. She was so proud of you." And my throat tightened instantly. And then she said, "I have a bride in Boston who needs the best photographer in the business. And I told her Everlight Studios is the best." And I thanked her for the referral professionally, and then Caroline paused, just long enough to let the next sentence land heavy. "The bride is your sister." And in that moment, I felt the universe lean forward like it was watching a chess match, because Victoria had unknowingly hired my company, signed a $15,000 non-refundable contract with my name on the ownership line, and had absolutely no idea. And Caroline knew exactly what she was doing when she referred her, because Grandma Eleanor always believed truth has a way of surfacing, whether you invite it or not. And if that wasn't enough poetic irony, I also learned through Caroline that Victoria had been bragging at her bridal brunch about inheriting Grandma's jewelry collection, telling her friends she'd be wearing the pearls to elite events, boasting about a collection she did not own and never would, while my mother nodded along, reinforcing the lie. And that right there is the core betrayal, not just favoritism, but active deception, rewriting reality to preserve status and ego. And here's the analogy I want you to sit with for a second. Trust in a family is like a contract written in invisible ink. You don't see the terms until someone violates them. And my parents had violated every clause without even realizing it. Fairness, honesty, protection, advocacy, all voided in favor of image management. And that's why the silver box wasn't revenge. It was exposure, because exposure doesn't require yelling. It only requires truth placed in the right moment and back in the present timeline. As I sat in the airport lounge watching planes taxi across the runway, my phone remained silent for a while because Victoria hadn't opened the gifts yet. The reception hadn't reached that ceremonial moment. And I sipped my coffee, slowly thinking about Grandma Eleanor's words about quiet treasures and preservation. And I realized something important that I want you to hear too. Sometimes the most powerful boundary you can set is not confrontation. It's patience, it's letting reality catch up to someone who has been outrunning it for years. and I'd check the time, 7:45 p.m., right about when dessert service would finish, and the MC would invite the bride to open a few gifts for show. And that's when my phone finally started vibrating like it was possessed. First one call, then another, then 5, then 10, Victoria's name flashing over and over like an alarm bell. Then my mother, then my father, messages stacking up like digital screams, and I didn't answer any of them because once you've delivered the truth, you don't owe anyone immediate emotional labor. And I watched the missed calls climb into the dozens while boarding was announced for my flight. And I walked toward the gate with a strange sense of peace mixed with adrenaline, because something irreversible had clearly detonated behind me, and I didn't need to witness it firsthand to know the blast radius was massive. And as I boarded the plane, one final message slipped through before I turned my phone off, from Marcus, Victoria's husband, apologizing for believing lies about me, admitting the reception had collapsed into chaos, that guests were filming, that his trust had cracked. And reading that message felt surreal, because when someone who benefited from the lie finally sees the truth, it creates a different kind of accountability, not loud, but permanent. And here's what just happened emotionally beneath the surface. Victoria's identity, my parents' narrative, and their public image all collided with reality in front of witnesses. And why it matters is this. Lies survive in private, they suffocate in public, and what could go wrong next is not just embarrassment, but consequence, relationships breaking, reputations shifting, power dynamics collapsing. As we proceed, you're going to see exactly how the ballroom reacted when the truth hit the room like a dropped glass, how my parents tried to regain control of a narrative they lost, and how Victoria discovered that the sister she erased quietly had become the most powerful person in the story without ever announcing it. When Victoria unfolded that document under crystal chandeliers and 400 watching eyes, she didn't just lose jewelry. She lost the story she'd been telling about herself her entire life, and the crowd wasn't about to let her rewrite it again. The moment Victoria lifted that silver box from the gift table, the universe finally stopped whispering and started shouting. And I want you to picture this clearly, because this is where illusion meets consequence in front of witnesses who can't pretend they didn't see it. Crystal chandeliers throwing light across polished marble floors, waiters clearing dessert plates, champagne glasses clinking softly, laughter fading into polite curiosity as the MC invited the bride to open a few gifts for the room like a performance, and Victoria floating toward that table like a queen approaching her throne, shoulders back, chin high, confidence wrapped around her like a custom gown, because this was her arena, her audience, her validation machine, and she reached for box after box, smiling graciously, performing gratitude like a trained actor, until her manicured hand landed on the smallest box, the silver one with the white ribbon, and she glanced at the card and laughed loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "Oh, look! A gift from my sister, the one who couldn't even afford to show up properly." And a few awkward chuckles rippled through the crowd, because people laugh when they don't know whether they're witnessing humor or cruelty. And Marcus shifted slightly beside her, not fully comfortable, but still playing his role. And Victoria untied the ribbon with theatrical exaggeration, expecting a joke gift, a cheap trinket, something she could publicly diminish to reinforce her superiority, because that's what narcissistic power looks like. It feeds on contrast. It needs someone smaller in the room to make itself feel large. And when she lifted the lid and saw the envelope inside, thick and official, her smile faltered for half a second. Just enough for the closest tables to notice. Just enough for Marcus to lean closer and whisper, "What is it?" And she pulled the papers out slowly, scanning the first page, then the second, and I wasn't there physically, but every muscle in my body could imagine the shift in her posture, the micro-tremors in her fingers, the way blood drains from a face when a narrative collapses faster than the brain can catch up. And here's what just happened on a psychological level. Victoria realized the box was not entertainment. It was information, and information is dangerous when it contradicts identity, because identity is the story we tell ourselves to survive, and hers was being ripped apart in real time. And she whispered, "This can't be real," like the universe might apologize and rewind, and Marcus leaned in again, reading the heading, the legal seals, the notarized signature, and his eyes widened slightly. Because Marcus lives in a world where contracts mean something, where ink has consequences, and suddenly, this wasn't drama, this was documentation. And Victoria dropped the handwritten letter like it burned her fingers, and that letter hit the floor between tables like a physical punctuation mark, and my mother rushed forward from the head table, because mothers always sense when their carefully curated image is about to be publicly damaged, and she said, "What's wrong, sweetheart?" In that tone she reserves for emergencies that might reflect poorly on her, and Victoria shoved the papers into her, hands shaking, and Patricia read the words declaring the Hartwell jewelry collection legally transferred to Myra Wells, sole beneficiary. And if you've ever watched someone process a truth they spent years denying, you know that look? The way the eyes widen slightly, the jaw stiffens, the brain scrambling to find an alternate explanation that preserves ego. And my father stepped closer, recognizing his mother's handwriting instantly, because you can't fake the muscle memory of a lifetime. And the room began to whisper like a low electrical hum, because humans can sense drama the way animals sense storms, and someone murmured, "Isn't that the jewelry she was talking about earlier?" And someone else whispered she said it was hers, and now the room had context, and context is what turns gossip into judgment. And Victoria's face twisted as she tried to regain control of the narrative like a politician caught mid-lie. "This is fake. She forged this. She's jealous of me." And that's the reflex of someone whose power has always been verbal. When reality contradicts them, they attack the messenger instead of addressing the message. And Marcus looked at her differently in that instant. Not with anger yet, but with recalculation, because trust doesn't shatter loudly. It fractures quietly first, and Caroline Ashford stepped forward like gravity itself, calm, composed, authoritative, and said clearly enough for several tables to hear, "This document is authentic. I witnessed. Eleanor Hartwell signed it 2 years ago." And you could feel the room lean in emotionally, because when a respected authority validates a truth, it stops being negotiable, and Caroline added that Eleanor had chosen intentionally, that Myra valued meaning over status, preservation over possession. And I want you to understand why that sentence mattered more than the money, because it reframed the entire moral hierarchy of the room. Suddenly this wasn't about who got what, it was about who deserved trust, who understood legacy, who had integrity. And Victoria's mouth opened, but nothing came out, because you can't argue with someone who knew your grandmother better than you did when your own behavior just confirmed the criticism. And then something fascinating happened socially. The crowd began to self-correct. One voice spoke up, then another, people who had worked with me, hired my company, seen my work, validating my credibility without realizing they were, dismantling Victoria's mythology piece by piece. And Richard Petton mentioned my company's revenue. Another guest referenced magazine features. Another mentioned waiting lists and reputation. And suddenly the room had a new story, one where the invisible sister was not invisible at all. She was simply operating outside the family's narrative bubble. And this is what exposure really looks like. Not humiliation for sport, but a collective recalibration of truth, where witnesses independently update their beliefs based on evidence. And Victoria stood there like a statue carved from disbelief, watching her social armor peel away layer by layer, and Marcus finally spoke in a tone so cold it silenced the room. "What else have you lied about?" And that question landed like a hammer, because it wasn't about the jewelry anymore, it was about character. And once character is questioned publicly, status becomes meaningless. And Victoria reached for her phone in a panic, because control. Addicts always reach for communication when they feel exposed. They need to manipulate, redirect, regain narrative power, but reality had already outrun her. And in that exact moment, my phone began lighting up in the airport lounge miles away, her name flashing like an emergency signal. Then my mother's, then my father's, missed calls stacking into the dozens, because when people lose control of a story, their first instinct is to reclaim the author, and I refused to answer, not out of cruelty, but out of self-respect, because here's something important I want you to understand. You don't owe immediate access to people who only recognize you when they need damage control. And as the plane boarded and I walked toward my seat, I read a message from Marcus apologizing for believing lies about me, admitting the reception had unraveled, that guests were filming, that trust had been shaken, and that apology mattered not because it fixed anything, but because it validated what I had lived for decades. And here's what just happened in emotional terms. Victoria lost narrative control, my parents lost image control, and the audience gained truth awareness. And why it matters is this: social accountability only exists when witnesses are present. Abuse and favoritism thrive in isolation. And what could go wrong next is deeper than embarrassment. Marriages fracture under revealed character. Careers wobble under public perception. Family dynamics shift permanently when illusions die. And that's exactly what began unfolding after the applause died and the whispers turned into recordings and uploaded clips and viral algorithms, chewing through private collapse like digital wildfire. And by the time my plane lifted into the night sky, a TikTok clip of Victoria's face shifting from smug to stunned had already hit millions of views. And people who had never met any of us were commenting on a dynamic they recognized instantly: the golden child unraveling when truth finally surfaces, the invisible sibling revealed as quietly powerful. And if you've ever watched someone who's been protected by favoritism suddenly lose the safety net, you know how disorienting that fall can be, because the world stops cushioning their behavior, and accountability feels like betrayal to people who have never been held responsible before. And over the next few hours, the fallout accelerated like a chain reaction. Marcus postponed the honeymoon. Victoria's employer placed her on leave. Clients whispered. Friends distanced themselves. My parents fielded uncomfortable calls from the Thornton family, asking if there were other lies they didn't know about. And my mother finally realized that the same silence she used to ignore me had trained Victoria to manipulate reality unchecked. And here's the uncomfortable moral lesson baked into all of this. Favoritism doesn't just hurt the neglected child. It corrupts the favored one. It teaches entitlement. It weakens accountability. It inflates ego until reality eventually collapses it violently. And that collapse rarely happens gently. And while all of this unfolded externally, something shifted internally for me too. Sitting in that airplane seat watching the city lights shrink below me, I realized I wasn't angry anymore, not vindictive, not bitter, not hungry for revenge. I felt resolved because the truth had spoken without me needing to scream. And that's the cleanest kind of justice, the kind that doesn't stain your hands. And I made a quiet boundary decision right there that I want you to really hear. I wouldn't chase. Reconciliation. I wouldn't beg for recognition. I wouldn't perform my worth for people who had spent decades refusing to look. If my family wanted a relationship moving forward, it would be built on honesty, accountability, and equal respect, not nostalgia, guilt, or image management. And that boundary felt like standing on solid ground for the first time in my life. And I want to challenge you directly right now, because this story isn't just entertainment. It's a mirror if you grew up in a family where love felt conditional, where approval was transactional, where favoritism distorted reality. Ask yourself honestly, who benefits from your silence and who pays the price for it? And do your parents get a free pass just because they're parents? Or does responsibility still apply when harm is repeated quietly over years? Drop in the comments whether you believe parents should be held accountable for favoritism or whether family loyalty should override personal dignity, because this debate matters more than people admit. And now, let me tell you why the next part gets even more complicated. Because public consequences are one thing, but private reckonings are where the real emotional damage and growth collide. And 3 days after the wedding chaos went viral, my mother showed up at my office unannounced, not as a polished socialite, not as a gatekeeper of family image, but as a woman finally forced to confront the child she had emotionally abandoned for nearly 3 decades. And that conversation would rewrite everything I thought closure looked like. When my mother walked into my office and realized the daughter she ignored had built an entire life without her, the silence between us became louder than any argument we'd ever avoided. When my mother walked into the lobby of Everlight Studios 3 days after the wedding implosion, the woman standing in front of my reception desk did not look like the polished socialite who used to glide through charity galas with practiced smiles and effortless authority. She looked smaller, uncertain, like someone who had accidentally stepped into a world that didn't revolve around her expectations. And the first thing she said wasn't my name, it was, "This is yours," said with disbelief as her eyes traced the floor-to-ceiling windows, the framed magazine covers, the awards mounted on the walls, the quiet hum of a business running efficiently without her ever knowing it existed. And in that moment, I felt something complicated rise in my chest. Not triumph, not bitterness, but a strange sadness for how long she had chosen not to see me, because this wasn't new success. This was years of invisible labor finally colliding with delayed recognition. And I said calmly, "Yes, Mom, this is mine." And she flinched like the words landed harder than she expected, because when parents realize the child they underestimated built a life without their support, it forces them to confront how unnecessary their neglect truly was. And I led her into my office, closed the door gently, and she sat across from me clutching her purse like a flotation device. And without warming up, she said, "I came to talk about what you did to your sister," because of course that's where her instincts went, not to curiosity, not to apology, but to damage control and loyalty to the child who reflected her image most clearly. And I leaned back in my chair and said evenly, "I wasn't at the wedding, Mom. Remember, I wasn't invited." And she waved it off like a technicality. "You know what I mean? That stunt with the gift. You humiliated her in front of everyone." And here's the first hard truth I want you to absorb. People who protect dysfunction always frame accountability as cruelty because it threatens the system they've spent years maintaining. And I replied calmly, "I didn't humiliate her. I delivered the truth that Grandma Eleanor legally documented 2 years ago. Everything in that box was real." And my mother's face tightened as if she were physically restraining years of denial from collapsing all at once. And she said, "But why in public? Why on her wedding day?" And I leaned forward slightly, not aggressively, but intentionally, because she chose to erase me publicly first. She told hundreds of people I didn't matter. She lied about my life. She bragged about an inheritance that was never hers. She weaponized silence and status to rewrite reality, and silence only protects lies. And my mother looked down at her hands, because people look away when they're finally hearing something they've avoided for decades, and she whispered, "I didn't know." And that's when I said the sentence that changed the energy in the room completely. "You didn't know because you didn't ask." And she inhaled sharply like the air had been knocked out of her, because that sentence cuts through every excuse parents use to justify emotional neglect. Not knowing is not innocence when curiosity was optional and ignored. And for a long moment neither of us spoke. And the office felt heavy with unsaid history. Birthdays forgotten, graduation skipped, phone calls centered on Victoria's achievements, silence masquerading as neutrality, and finally my mother's composure cracked, not the polished crying she used to deploy for sympathy at social functions, but raw, shaking sobs that startled even her. And she said between breaths, "We failed you. I failed you. I didn't protect you. I let her dominate everything. I thought you were strong enough not to need us." And that sentence, right, there is the most dangerous misunderstanding in family dynamics, mistaking quiet resilience for lack of need, mistaking independence for emotional immunity. And I replied quietly, I stopped, "Needing you because I learned you wouldn't show up." And she winced as if the truth physically hurt, because guilt hurts most when it's accurate. And she started confessing things she'd never admitted before. How Victoria demanded attention constantly, how managing her moods felt like managing a storm, how giving Victoria what she wanted felt easier than confronting her entitlement, how my quietness gave them permission to ignore me. And as she spoke, I realized something uncomfortable, but important. My parents weren't villains in a movie sense. They were weak in the way many people are weak, choosing comfort over courage, convenience over fairness, short-term peace over long-term responsibility. And that weakness had cost me years of emotional invisibility. And I let her speak without interrupting, because sometimes people need to hear themselves say the truth out loud before they can change. And when she finally looked at me again, her eyes red and exhausted, she said, "Eleanor tried to warn me. She said I was losing you." I thought she was being dramatic. And there it was, the final confirmation that Grandma Eleanor had seen this coming long before I ever named it. And I nodded slowly. She always saw what others didn't. And my mother whispered, "I see it now." And that moment didn't feel like forgiveness. It felt like a door cracking open after years of being sealed shut, fragile but real. And before she left, she told me what had been happening back in Boston since the video went viral. Marcus postponing the honeymoon. His parents questioning everything they thought they knew about Victoria. Victoria placed on leave from work due to reputational concerns, social circles growing quiet, invitations drying up, the golden ecosystem that had protected her slowly retracting its warmth. And my mother said quietly, "She blames you for everything." And I answered honestly, "That's easier than taking responsibility." And my mother nodded reluctantly because deep down she knew it was true. And when she left my office, she didn't leave as a victorious parent or a reconciled one. She left as someone finally awake to consequences that couldn't be undone. And after the door closed behind her, I sat alone staring out at the city skyline, feeling something settle into place inside me. Not closure, but clarity, because clarity is the beginning of boundaries, and boundaries are the beginning of peace. And that evening, as the sun dipped behind the buildings, I made a decision I had avoided my entire life. I would no longer contort myself to earn belonging from people who had treated my presence as optional. I would not chase apologies. I would not shrink my truth to preserve their comfort. And I wrote it down in my journal in plain language. I will not close the door on them, but I will not hold it open forever either. They have to choose to walk through. And that sentence felt like oxygen in my lungs. And over the next few days, the ripple effects continued. My father sent a handwritten letter apologizing for years of blindness and misplaced priorities. 3 pages of regret that I read slowly without rushing to respond, because healing doesn't operate on someone else's timeline. Victoria sent nothing, only silence and indirect anger through family channels. And that silence told me more than any dramatic confrontation ever could, because accountability terrifies people who have built their identity on entitlement. And I also watched something unexpected unfold professionally. The viral video had turned Everlight Studios into a lightning rod of attention. Inquiries flooding in, media requests piling up, strangers projecting empowerment narratives onto my story. And while some part of me appreciated the validation, another part felt uneasy, because public applause is not the same thing as private healing, and I intentionally declined interviews and focused on stabilizing the business instead, because my life was not a spectacle for consumption. It was a real human rebuilding process. And a week later, I went to the bank to finally see the Hartwell jewelry collection in person. 12 pieces resting inside. A private vault like sleeping history, pearls from the 1920s, Art Deco diamonds, a sapphire brooch with a lineage older than anyone in my family. And as I held each piece carefully, I felt Grandma Eleanor's presence strongly, not in a mystical sense, but in the intentionality of her choices. She hadn't given me these to elevate status. She'd given them to preserve meaning. And I arranged for the most historically significant pieces to be loaned to the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, honoring her legacy publicly rather than hoarding it privately. And that choice felt aligned with who she was and who I wanted to be. And inside the vault, the banker handed me a small sealed envelope that had been overlooked. Inside was a note in Grandma's handwriting saying she had left Victoria a simple pearl bracelet, not valuable monetarily, but meaningful symbolically, hoping one day Victoria might understand its worth. And that broke me a little, because even in death, Grandma still held hope for redemption where I had grown cautious. And I cried quietly in that bank lobby, not from sadness alone, but from gratitude for having been truly seen by at least one adult in my childhood. And 6 months passed after the wedding chaos. The viral noise faded. Life stabilized into something calmer and healthier. My mother called weekly, and we began rebuilding something fragile but honest. My father waited patiently for me to respond to his letter. Victoria remained distant and defensive, and I learned to be okay with that uncertainty, because boundaries are not punishments, they are protections. And I realized something else too that I want you to think about. Sometimes the reckoning we expect to be explosive arrives quietly through changed behavior, through consequences that linger longer than any dramatic confrontation ever could. And this story isn't about winning, it's about reclaiming agency after emotional erasure. It's about recognizing when loyalty becomes self-betrayal, and Whether parents crossing emotional lines should be forgiven automatically simply because of biology, and I want you to really engage with that question in the comments because it's uncomfortable but necessary. Do parents deserve unconditional forgiveness when favoritism damages children long term, or should accountability still apply regardless of family title? Because pretending harm didn't happen does not heal it, and now it closes on this tension point my family standing at the edge of. Possible reconciliation, but only if truth and responsibility replace denial and entitlement. And the next part is where the final emotional consequences land, where Victoria finally makes her move, where reconciliation is tested, and where I decide whether protecting my peace means opening the door or leaving it closed. When Victoria finally broke her silence and reached out, I realized forgiveness isn't a feeling, it's a boundary negotiation, and the terms were about to be tested. When Victoria finally broke her silence 6 weeks after the wedding disaster, the notification didn't feel dramatic or explosive. It felt strangely small. Just her name lighting up my phone while I was standing in line for coffee, like any other ordinary human moment. And that contrast alone tells you something about power, because people who once controlled the emotional temperature of your life eventually become just another vibration in your pocket when you reclaim your center. And I stared at the screen for a long second, not out of fear, not out of anger, but out of clarity, because this was the moment I had quietly prepared myself for, the moment where all the public chaos finally distilled into a private choice. And here's what just happened internally. The part of me that used to crave validation from my family had already died. But the part of me that valued integrity and accountability was wide awake, and I answered the call calmly, and Victoria didn't launch into accusations or screaming like I expected. Her voice sounded flat, tired, stripped of its usual performance polish, and she said, "I don't know what to say," and that sentence alone told me more than any apology script ever could. Because when someone who has always dominated conversations suddenly doesn't know what to say, it means reality has finally outrun their ego, and she continued, "Everything fell apart. Marcus barely speaks to me. My job put me on leave. People I thought were friends won't return my calls, and everyone thinks I'm some kind of monster." And I listened without interrupting, not because I felt obligated, but because this was the first time in my life she was speaking from consequence instead of entitlement. And then she said the sentence I'd been waiting years to hear. Not perfectly, not poetically, but honestly. "I didn't realize how much I hurt you until everyone saw me the way you've always seen me." And that sentence landed differently than an apology because it acknowledged perspective, not just outcome. And I asked her calmly, "Do you understand what you did, or do you just understand what you lost?" And there was a long silence on the line, the kind where someone is finally forced to confront their own reflection without filters. And she said quietly, "Both." And that's when I knew this conversation wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about whether growth was actually possible or just theatrics for damage control. And I told her the truth without cushioning it. "You didn't just exclude me from a wedding. You excluded me from the family for years. You treated me like background noise. You measured my worth by your standards. You used our parents' silence as permission to dehumanize me. And that changes how safe I feel around you." And she didn't interrupt. She didn't deflect. She didn't minimize, and that alone marked a psychological shift I never thought I'd see. And she said, "I know, and I don't expect forgiveness. I just want a chance to stop being this person." And here's where the reckoning really happens, not in dramatic confrontations, not in viral videos, but in boundary negotiations between two adults who no longer accept the old roles. And I told her something that surprised even me. "If you want a relationship with me, it can't look like the old one. There's no hierarchy, no dismissiveness, no rewriting my life to make yourself feel superior. And if that ever comes back, I will walk away without explanation." And she said, "That's fair." And I believed her not because of her words, but because of the way she said them, stripped of entitlement, stripped of leverage, stripped of performance. And we didn't hug it out emotionally. We didn't resolve decades of dysfunction in one call. But we reset the terms of engagement like adults instead of rivals. And that's what healthy reconciliation actually looks like. Slow, conditional, grounded in behavior instead of sentiment. And after we hung up, I sat quietly with my coffee, thinking about how strange growth can feel when it finally arrives. Not triumphant, not cinematic, just calm and grounded, like your nervous system finally believes you're safe. And over the next few months, something unexpected happened. My family dynamic began changing in small but real ways. My mother stopped centering conversations on Victoria's achievements and started asking about my work genuinely, not performatively. My father showed patience instead of authority, listening more than speaking. And Victoria began showing humility in subtle ways, asking questions instead of making declarations, acknowledging when she didn't understand something instead of pretending superiority. And none of it was perfect, none of it erased the past, but it established something new: accountability replacing entitlement, curiosity replacing dominance. And that shift matters more than any apology speech ever could. And I want you to hear this clearly. Reconciliation is not a reward you give someone for feeling bad. It's a process you allow when consistent behavior demonstrates growth. And if that behavior ever reverses, the door closes again without guilt. And here's another layer that surprised me emotionally. The viral fame faded, the comments slowed, the world moved on. But my internal stability remained stronger than ever, because the validation I once wanted from strangers or family had been replaced by self-trust. And that's the real victory most revenge stories never show. Not dominance over someone else, but sovereignty over yourself. And one afternoon, while reorganizing my office, I found the original camera Grandma Eleanor gave me when I was 10, still functional, still worn at the edges, and I held it for a long moment, remembering that little girl who felt invisible in a big, quiet house. And I realized something powerful. That camera wasn't just a gift, it was a survival tool. It taught me to observe truth when adults refused to speak it. It trained my eye to notice patterns of power, neglect, entitlement, and humanity. And without realizing it, it prepared me for exactly this life, for navigating complexity with clarity instead of resentment. And I took a photo of the sunset that evening just for myself, not for clients, not for social media, not for validation, because sometimes reclaiming joy privately is the most radical form of healing. And a few weeks later, Marcus emailed me unexpectedly, not about Victoria, not about the wedding fallout, but simply to say thank you for responding with integrity instead of hostility, and that he and Victoria were continuing therapy seriously, that trust was slowly rebuilding, and that he respected how I handled everything without escalating drama. And reading that message reminded me of something else important. How you handle power when it lands in your hands defines your character more than how you survive powerlessness. And I chose restraint over humiliation, boundaries over vengeance, clarity over chaos. And that choice protected my future relationships more than any public win ever could. And as months passed, I began receiving messages from viewers who had seen the viral clip or heard the story. People sharing their own experiences of being the invisible child, the scapegoat, the quiet achiever, the one whose worth was never acknowledged until it disrupted the system. And those messages humbled me deeply, because they reminded me this story wasn't just mine. It reflected a pattern that exists in many families. Favoritism disguised as love, silence mistaken for strength, neglect normalized as neutrality. And I want you to understand the moral lesson here without sugarcoating it. Parents shape the emotional ecosystem of their households, whether they admit it or not. Favoritism creates entitlement in one child and invisibility in another, and both outcomes cause damage. And pretending biology automatically justifies forgiveness is how cycles of harm continue unchallenged. Accountability is not punishment, it is correction. And correction is the only thing that prevents repetition. And if you're someone watching this who grew up feeling unseen, underestimated, or erased in your own family, hear me clearly. Your worth was never missing. Their perception was, and you do not need to perform success, pain, or obedience to earn basic respect. And if you're someone who recognizes themselves in Victoria's early behavior, entitlement, dismissal, superiority, understand this too. Growth is possible, but only when ego steps aside and responsibility steps forward. And here's where this story lands emotionally, not with fireworks, not with domination, but with grounded self-respect. My family is no longer built on silence and hierarchy. It is being rebuilt slowly on honesty and boundaries. And if that ever slips, I am prepared to protect my peace without guilt because healing does not mean tolerating harm in a new costume. And I want to ask you something directly now because your perspective matters in stories like this. Do you believe family loyalty should override personal dignity? Or do you believe boundaries are necessary even with blood relatives? And have you ever had to choose yourself over family expectations? Share your story in the comments, because these conversations help people realize they're not alone in navigating emotional complexity. And if this story resonated with you, share it with someone who might need the reminder that invisibility is not identity. And strength doesn't have to be loud to be real. And if you want to continue exploring stories about reclaiming power, setting boundaries, and confronting hidden family dynamics, the next video dives even deeper into a betrayal that starts even earlier in childhood and ends with a confrontation no one expects. And trust me, you want to see how that one unfolds, because sometimes the quietest people hold the loudest truths when they finally decide to speak. The strange thing about reckoning is that it doesn't arrive like a thunderclap most of the time. It settles in like weather, slow, persistent, reshaping the landscape while you're busy living your life. And by the time you realize the terrain has changed, you're already standing on new ground. And that's exactly how the final chapter of this story unfolded for me. Not in another viral explosion, not in a courtroom showdown or a screaming match in a hotel lobby, but in the quiet, uncomfortable work of rebuilding identity after illusion collapses. Because once the lies burn off, you're left staring at the raw structure underneath. And you have to decide whether you're going to reinforce it or let it crumble completely. A few months after Victoria and I had that first real conversation, the one where she admitted she finally understood both what she lost and what she caused, my father asked if he could come visit me in Los Angeles. Not as a family obligation, not for appearances, but just to talk, and that alone was a shift, because my father had always been a man who communicated through authority and logistics, not vulnerability or curiosity. And when he walked into my office that afternoon, he stood there, awkwardly for a moment, like a guest in a museum exhibit labeled "The Daughter You Didn't Bother to Know." And he said quietly, "I didn't realize how big your world had become." And I didn't answer defensively or sarcastically. I simply said, "It had to, Dad, because the one I grew up in didn't have room for me." And he nodded slowly, absorbing that truth without interrupting for once. And we talked for 2 hours about everything we had never talked about, my childhood, loneliness, the pressure. He put on Victoria to succeed as a reflection of his own insecurities, the way ambition can masquerade as love when you're emotionally illiterate, the way silence becomes cruelty when it replaces protection. And he apologized without qualifiers, without excuses, without blaming circumstances, and that matters, because a real apology isn't about relieving the apologizer's guilt. It's about acknowledging the harm fully even when it's uncomfortable to sit inside it. And I told him forgiveness wasn't automatic, but accountability was visible, and that we would rebuild slowly, not through grand gestures, but through consistent respect. And when he left that evening, I didn't feel healed, but I felt lighter, like another weight I'd been carrying since childhood had finally been set down consciously instead of dragged forward unconsciously. Around the same time, Victoria and Marcus invited me to dinner. Not a flashy restaurant, not a performance environment, just a quiet neighborhood place near their apartment. And that choice alone signaled humility, because Victoria used to equate value with optics. And during that dinner, something subtle but profound happened. Victoria listened more than she spoke. She asked questions instead of making declarations. She acknowledged moments from our childhood she had dismissed or minimized. She didn't defend herself reflexively when something was uncomfortable. And that behavioral shift mattered more than any dramatic apology ever could. Because character change reveals itself through habits, not speeches, and Marcus spoke honestly about how the wedding incident forced him to confront how easily people can be misled by confidence and curated narratives. How he learned the danger of assuming family dynamics reflect reality simply because they're presented confidently in hearing him say. That validated something deep inside me, because so many people mistake assertiveness for truth and silence for insignificance, and that misinterpretation shapes entire social ecosystems without anyone realizing it. Over the following months, our family gatherings changed shape, no longer centered around Victoria's milestones as the default focus, no longer revolving around status updates and performance narratives, but becoming more balanced, more human, sometimes awkward, sometimes clumsy, but grounded in reality rather than image management. And that transition wasn't smooth. There were moments of tension, moments where old habits tried to resurface, moments where someone would slip into dismissive language or competitive framing. And each time I calmly reinforced the boundary without escalation, without drama, simply stating, that's not how we speak to each other anymore. And the consistency of that boundary slowly rewired the dynamic, because boundaries are not about control, they're about clarity, and clarity creates safety over time. Professionally, Everlight Studios stabilized into a healthier rhythm after the viral spike faded. The inquiry flood normalized, the media noise quieted, and I deliberately focused on building sustainable systems instead of riding short-term attention. Because success that grows faster than your infrastructure eventually collapses under its own weight, and that discipline mirrored the emotional discipline I was applying in my personal life. Slow growth, stable foundations, intentional decisions. And one afternoon, while reviewing new project proposals, I paused and realized something that made me smile quietly. I was no longer motivated by proving anything to anyone. Not my parents, not Victoria, not strangers on the internet. I was motivated by craft, by integrity, by building something meaningful on my own terms, and that internal shift felt like adulthood finally settling into my bones. A few weeks later, I received a handwritten letter from Grandma Eleanor's foundation board thanking me for loaning the jewelry pieces to the museum, explaining how the exhibit had drawn record attendance and sparked conversations about preservation, legacy, and women patrons in early 20th century art circles. And reading that letter brought tears to my eyes because it felt like a continuation of Grandma's values moving forward through me instead of being frozen in objects or money. And that reinforced something I deeply believe now. Legacy is not what you accumulate, it's what you transmit: values, courage, perspective, accountability. And that's why favoritism is so destructive in families, because it distorts what gets transmitted. It rewards entitlement instead of responsibility. It amplifies ego instead of empathy. And it teaches children to measure worth externally instead of internally. And both the favored and neglected child suffer in different ways, even if the damage expresses itself differently. About 9 months after the wedding incident, Victoria invited me to attend a small therapy session with her and Marcus, not to relitigate the past, but to help close certain loops constructively. And during that session, something powerful happened. Victoria acknowledged in front of a neutral professional that she had internalized validation as oxygen, that she learned early in life that achievement equaled love and superiority equaled safety, that she didn't know how to relate to people without competing or controlling. And hearing her articulate that self-awareness without defensiveness confirmed for me that genuine growth was underway. Not perfect, not linear, but real. And I told her honestly that while the past could not be erased, the future could be rewritten if accountability remained consistent. And that moment felt like a quiet victory, not over her, but over the dysfunctional script we were all raised inside. At the 1-year mark after the wedding fallout, we gathered as a family for a small holiday dinner, not lavish, not performative, just homemade food and conversation. And halfway through the evening, my mother looked around the table and said softly, "This feels different." And my father nodded and said, "It feels honest." And I felt a warmth spread through my chest, because honesty is something our family had avoided for decades in favor of image. And now it was becoming the new normal, slowly, imperfectly, but steadily. And that shift alone made every difficult conversation, every boundary, every uncomfortable truth worth it. Now, let me step back from the narrative for a moment and speak directly to you, because stories like this resonate for a reason. Not because of the jewelry, not because of viral videos, not because of public embarrassment, but because many people watching recognize the emotional pattern instantly: the invisible child, the golden child, the parents who confuse provision with presence, the silence that allows entitlement to grow unchecked, the quiet one who learns to survive without validation, the loud one who learns to dominate to feel safe. And if any of that feels familiar, I want you to understand something deeply. You're not broken for noticing it. You're not dramatic for being affected by it. and you're not disloyal for setting boundaries around it. Family loyalty that requires self-erasure is not loyalty. It's self-abandonment disguised as virtue. And healing does not mean pretending harm didn't happen. It means integrating truth into how you move forward. If you are the invisible one, the quiet achiever, the child who learned to disappear to survive, your worth was never the problem. The environment simply didn't know how to nurture you properly. And your job now is not to prove anything to anyone. It's to protect the version of yourself that finally learned to breathe freely. If you recognize yourself more in Victoria's early behavior, entitlement, superiority, dismissiveness, control, understand this too. Those patterns were learned, not innate, and they can be unlearned if you're willing to tolerate discomfort, accountability, and humility long enough to grow. But growth only begins when excuses end. And for parents watching, this story carries a quiet warning. Neutrality in the face of favoritism is not neutrality. It is endorsement. Silence teaches children what behavior is acceptable more powerfully than lectures ever could, and emotional absence cannot be compensated for with money, opportunity, or status. As for me, my life continues in a grounded way now. I run my company with intention. I nurture friendships that are reciprocal and honest. I maintain boundaries that protect my peace. And I stay curious about who I'm becoming rather than who I was forced to be. And sometimes in the evenings I still take out Grandma Eleanor's old camera and walk through my neighborhood photographing ordinary moments, light on brick walls, people laughing on sidewalks, quiet corners of the city that most people overlook. And it reminds me that beauty has always lived in noticing, not in performing, in presence, not in validation. So here's my question for you as this story closes, and I genuinely want you to engage with it in the comments because these conversations matter. Have you ever had to confront favoritism, emotional neglect, or manipulation within your own family? And how did it shape the way you see yourself today? Did you set boundaries? Did you stay silent? Did you walk away? Did you reconcile? And what did it cost you emotionally? And what did it give you back? Share your story below because someone reading it may realize they're not alone for the first time. And if this story stirred something in you, if it made you rethink loyalty, boundaries, identity, or self-worth, share it with someone who might need that perspective too. If you want to continue exploring stories that dig into hidden family dynamics, quiet resilience, moral reckoning, and emotional power shifts, the next video goes even deeper into a betrayal that begins in childhood and ends with a confrontation no one sees coming. And trust me, you want to watch it because sometimes the most dangerous lies are the ones we grow up believing about ourselves.